Welcome everybody to this webinar on evaluative thinking. My name is Thomas Schwandt, and I've been involved in the field of evaluation in various ways for about 35 years. Ideas about evaluative thinking have been floating around the field for many years, but relatively recent, the attention has been more sharply focused on the idea of evaluative thinking, in part because of the broad global interest in evaluation capacity building, of which evaluative thinking is an important part, but also because of some work of three practitioner scholars, Ann Vo, Tom Archibald, and Jane Buckley, who have written quite a few papers about the idea of evaluative thinking. And when we get to the end of this webinar today, I have a slide with some additional references, and so you can see how you might access some of the things that they've written about. But like many terms in evaluation, including terms like use and causality and scientific method and so forth, there's no single agreed upon definition of evaluative thinking. Though I would say generally we get along pretty fine, practically speaking, without having total agreement on the meaning of the term. Here's the definition, of course, that Samia has suggested, that evaluative thinking is a way of viewing the world as an ongoing process of critical reflection, as well as appraisal of assumptions and claims, and that's all coupled with a continuous commitment to learning. In this webinar, what I'd like to do is look at this notion of evaluative thinking in a bit more depth. And I'll actually suggest that there are two ways in which evaluative thinking is understood as a way of looking at the world. So there are actually two very distinct ways of understanding evaluative thinking, and there's some relationship between the two. On the one hand, there is the idea that evaluative thinking is a kind of critical thinking applied specifically to the contexts of evaluation. And in some ways, this is a view consistent with the Samia definition that I just gave you. But there are other scholars who look at evaluative thinking as a specific kind of logic of evaluation. And I'll try to explain both views here in a second. But let's first look at the critical thinking idea, evaluative thinking as critical thinking. Here's an example of how evaluative thinking is equated with critical thinking. And this comes from the work of Tom Archibald that you see here. But notice that the emphasis is on a particular kind of mental or cognitive process in the context of evaluation. And then you have these sort of dispositions that go with it, these attitudes of inquisitiveness, and that you pose thoughtful questions and so on and so forth. They're very, very similar to what we think of as critical thinking. And the foundation for critical thinking here in the US is a big leader in defining critical thinking and its applications. So here's how they talk about critical thinking as a particular kind of thinking in which one improves the quality of thinking by skillfully analyzing, assessing, and reconstructing how you think. It's very self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and it's a kind of self-corrective process. You can read more about it there at the link that I've provided. They also point out that critical thinking requires certain kinds of skills, and that the person who is a critical thinker has particular kinds of dispositions or personal traits. So the skills that you would need when you think of evaluative thinking as critical thinking are the ability to interpret, to make inferences, to carefully analyze, to explain thoroughly, to probe unstated assumptions. And the kinds of attitudes or dispositions or traits you would need are these kinds of things. You're a person who's habitually inquisitive, you're open and fair-minded, you face your biases honestly, you're prudent in your assessments, and you're diligent in the search for information and facts. They also argue, the foundation also argues, and again, I think this is consistent with a view of evaluative thinking as critical thinking, that these kinds of behaviors is what would be exhibited if one is a critical thinker. And so here you have some, I don't have to read them all, you can look at them, but you'll notice this is very much in line with how we think about evaluation. You raise vital questions, carefully formulate the problems or questions and problems, you gather relevant information, you come to some kind of well-reasoned conclusions about the evidence, you think open-mindedly, you communicate effectively. So these are the behaviors that one would associate with evaluative thinking as critical thinking, as we saw earlier in the definition from Archibald and in the Samia definition. We might also note that this kind of thinking and these kinds of behaviors are something that an evaluator would probably try to also cultivate in stakeholders to the evaluation. In other words, including both clients and consumers of evaluation. That's part of the whole idea of evaluative thinking linked to the process use of evaluation, is you're building the capacity of your clients and your consumers to also engage in evaluative thinking. And it's not unreasonable to say that almost every professional in some capacity, whether you're a doctor or a program auditor or a policy analyst or a lawyer or what have you, would use some kind of skills and abilities and have the dispositions characteristic of a critical thinker, so that critical thinking would cut across these different professional responsibilities. Now, let's turn to the second way of thinking about evaluative thinking, and that is evaluative thinking linked to something called the logic of evaluation. And this originates in this paper that I'm mentioning here, written by Michael Scriven, and some would argue that it is to Scriven's work that this notion is particularly attributable. And more or less, I think the people who endorse this view of evaluative thinking would probably use the phrase evaluative reasoning rather than evaluative thinking. They would say there's a particular kind of logic of evaluation that is evaluative reasoning. And it underlies the way we make inferences in the field of evaluation specifically. So the evaluative reasoning in this view, all right, or evaluative thinking thought of as evaluative reasoning, follows this particular logic of evaluation that you all probably are familiar with in some way. There's four-step logic, that you have some sort of criteria on which you evaluate the thing you're interested in. You set standards for performance on those criteria. You gather data about the performance on the criteria, and then you summarize that all up, or you synthesize that into the results of a final value judgment. That is the logic of evaluative reasoning, and the specific way of thinking about evaluative thinking. Now, this is what is said to make evaluation reasoning distinct from the kind of reasoning that would happen in other professions. So let me show you in a couple of examples. So here is what, in a real simplified way, a scheme for what legal reasoning would follow. What's the issue? What are the facts? What's the rule? How do you apply the rule of the facts? Come to some legal conclusion. That's a kind of form of legal reasoning. And the argument is evaluative reasoning would be distinct from this kind of thing. Here's another example. Clinical reasoning employed particularly by nurses and doctors. Notice how it follows this kind of circular process. And again, the argument is that evaluative reasoning is distinct from the clinical reasoning cycle. And again, we could argue that it is distinct for this very reason, that evaluative reasoning, or if you prefer, evaluative thinking, thought of as evaluative reasoning is distinct because it's about combining matters of fact with matters of value to come to some evaluative conclusion. So here you can see all three of them put together, and you can notice how the evaluative reasoning schema is different than the legal reasoning schema and the clinical reasoning schema. Now, to try to dig just a little bit deeper into what this evaluative reasoning would require. And this is from Jane Davidson, who worked closely with Michael Scriven, and she also is a strong proponent of this view of the logic of evaluation and evaluative reasoning. And she argues that the way you do it is you gather evidence on the performance of the evaluand on particular criteria, all right? And you interpret how good that evidence is relative to how the evaluand is performing. And then you take the ratings of performance across all these criteria and you combine them into some general statement. And now what I want to emphasize here is that in this way of thinking about evaluative thinking, in other words, when you endorse the idea of evaluative reasoning and the logic of evaluation, generally their view is that if you aren't doing this, you are not doing evaluation. So it's the actual activity of evaluative reasoning that defines doing evaluation in their view. To elaborate a little bit further, this kind of reasoning is not typically the one you're familiar with that's either inductive or deductive, but it has the fancy word probative. But here's a real simple example of what probative reasoning means. And probative simply means it has the quality of demonstrating something. So let's suppose, because I've been a teacher for many years, I'm grading a student's short answer essay question, and I have criteria. First criterion is it an original approach? Second criterion is the essay clearly stated, the argument clearly stated? Is it well argued as a third criterion? And does it cover the topic that was asked and therefore I've rated on all those criteria, and I come to the probative conclusion that it deserves an A. Right? So I'm making an inference from the empirical evidence of my evaluation of the essay to an evaluative conclusion that it gets the grade of A. Right? Now, often we would do this, as you're probably familiar with. I would have some rubrics for each of those four criteria. What constitutes an original approach? How do I decide it's clearly stated, and so on and so forth? I would use some kind of rubric for each of those. Now, I want to point out, and this is a really big, important warning, not all evaluators agree with this way of defining evaluation based on this notion of evaluative reasoning. There are many evaluators who are more or less happy with thinking of evaluation as a form of applied social science, where we as evaluators use the tools of the social scientists to gather information about how a program or policy or what have you is performing and to present it to decision makers. And by and large, these folks would also be happy with the view of evaluative thinking as a particular kind of critical thinking. So to summarize, we've looked at two ways of understanding evaluative thinking, one as a type of critical thinking, and secondly, as a unique form of reasoning that defines evaluation as a particular kind of undertaking concerned with the determination of value. Well, before I end today, I would like to add two more issues very briefly that are often discussed in the literature on evaluative thinking. The first is the question of whether evaluative thinking is always just about the individual solitary thinker. And the second issue is there an inevitable conflict between critical thinking and indigenous knowledges and wisdom? So let's look at this first one. The idea of the solitary critical thinker, right? Something going on inside the head of the individual cognizing evaluator. Much of the literature in evaluative thinking focuses on the cognitive capacities of the individual reasoning person, right? The evaluator as a critical, reflective thinker concerned with higher order thinking skills and intellectual habits. It's very sort of solitary, individually focused, okay, as is typical in the psychology literature. But there is considerable reason to believe that evaluative thinking is as much a collective and social undertaking as it is a private and individual one. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with evaluations where many different individuals or groups with different stakes or specific concerns are involved in some way to establish a common point of view on which to evaluate something. In other words, what they collectively think should count as important evaluation questions, relevant criteria, appropriate evidence, and so forth. So evaluative thinking in that kind of circumstance is really a collaborative undertaking. And this would be particularly true in forms of participatory evaluation, as many of you may be familiar with. So from this social cognition perspective, the argument would be to better understand evaluative thinking, we don't need to just look at the literature on individual psychology, but to look at the literature on how social knowledge is produced, how social structure influences the production of evaluative knowledge, at group behavior, at collective sense-making, and to deal with notions like intersubjectivity as a key dimension of evaluative thinking. Now, as to this last issue, there are some scholars and practitioners who would say there's a tension between critical thinking and indigenous ways of knowing, particularly because critical thinking is often held up as a standard for good reasoning. And it's obvious that critical thinking is clearly an essential aspect of Western processes of knowledge production and evaluation. And in many cases, it's considered to be the driver of innovation and progress. So we talk about how logical reasoning methods and logical argumentation, along with analytic reasoning, are often spoken of as norms against which all other forms of human reasoning are to be compared. Now, in my judgment, this attitude could create problems for how we value indigenous knowledges that are produced, owned, distributed, and used in ways quite different from the ways common in the Western tradition. Indigenous knowledges are often grounded in holistic versus analytic systems of thought. And the evaluative thinking literature is very much grounded in this analytic system of thought. Indigenous knowledges often reflect efforts to achieve a middle ground or a dialectic between opposing views, whereas critical thinking and the Western tradition is very much given to a dichotomous form of reasoning. It's either this or that, it's fact or value, it's meaningful or meaningless, it's true or false, all right? And therefore it's seeking to sharply differentiate perspectives from one from the other. But the issue would be, is there an inevitable conflict between this way of thinking, critical thinking as a Western phenomenon, and indigenous knowledge and wisdom? And I don't think it has to be inevitably the case. I believe we could employ a kind of both ways philosophy in which we support the creation of dialogic spaces where new understandings of what counts as valuable knowledge and evidence in evaluation can be constructed. I think we can create a dialogical space in which we acknowledge and honor multiplicity of ways of living and knowing and learning in how that are involved in scoping and planning and conducting an evaluation. And I think we can collectively learn to reason well and fairly through lots of complex issues, through interdependent issues, uncertainty and diversity that's characteristic of working with multiple stakeholders, multiple points of view, multiple ways of knowing. I think all of us have to ask ourselves some key questions like, am I being clear? Am I thinking in ways that are just and fair? Am I attending to the kinds of complexities that are inherent in what we're talking about? Am I sticking to what we're talking about and not going off and talking about something else? Do I need to consider other points of view, and what's the best way to consider those? These are all hallmarks of evaluative thinking, it seems to me. And of course, all these notions about, am I thinking clearly, fairly, justly? Do I have good reasons? They themselves are subject to being examined through critical thinking. So there you have it. This is a kind of brief Cook's tour of the notion of evaluative thinking from two perspectives. I leave you today with a number of references in addition to the ones that are embedded in the other slides. Thanks for listening to this short presentation, and I hope you found it useful.